Hello, fellow skeptics, and welcome to this week's show. Skeptics in the Pub Online is a collaboration of a large group of skeptics groups working through this pandemic to provide you with a weekly presentation with a skeptical angle. If you like what we're doing and would like to make a donation, please visit sitp.online/donate. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Merseyside Skeptics have taken over the publishing of The Skeptic. The Skeptic are once again presenting the Occam Awards, and this year they've decided to award them live here on Skeptics in the Pub Online. It'll be next week before Pixie's talk at 7 o'clock. So our talk will start a little later, but please turn up at the normal time to see who wins the award for skeptical activism and the coveted Rusty Razor. As we can't have QED this year, the QED organisers have decided we should have QED 2018 again. So whether you went and want to relive some good memories, or you didn't go and want to see some of the amazing talks, then it's this weekend on 2 Twitch channels. We'll be hosting panels and podcast track here on SITP Online channel, and the main stage track will be on the QEDCon channel. For more details, visit qedcon.org, and I'm sure one of our lovely mods will post that in the chat for me. Tonight's format will be the usual, a talk for about an hour, followed by a break and a chance to go to the bar, and then afterwards a Q&A. If you want to ask a question for Steve, please go to sitp.online/ask. Tonight, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Steve Barrett, a senior research fellow in the Department of Physics at Liverpool University. His research interests span all aspects of imaging, image processing, and image analysis. This includes medical imaging, scanning probe microscopy of atoms, molecules, and surfaces, microscopy of Earth materials, and astrophotography. Please put your virtual hands together for Dr. Steve Barrett.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. So this is a talk about UFOs, and as you can see from the subtitle there, I'm asking the question, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? So I'm not talking about reports of UFO sightings, I'm not talking about alien abductions, I'm talking about if we look at a selection of images that purport to be UFOs, can we find explanations? Are we left with any that defy explanation? So let's just start with a few statistics, because of course statistics don't lie, we all know that. And if we ask the question, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? Well, I couldn't find many surveys, but the one I could find was from Chapman University in 2018, in which they got the response from 40% of people saying, yes, extraterrestrials have at some point visited the Earth. Now, as this is Chapman University, I presume that their survey selection was confined to America. I don't know exactly how many people they polled. It would be interesting to do this same survey throughout the world and find out what that particular fraction is. But you might be a von Daniken believer and believe that extraterrestrials have visited in the ancient history of Earth. But what about the question, are extraterrestrial aliens visiting us now? Then you could ask, well, it comes down from 40% to what sort of level? Well, it comes down a little bit, 35%. So that is perhaps a somewhat surprising value. If we put it in context, that's less than the number who believe in ghosts, but greater than the number who believe in telekinesis, or indeed Bigfoot. But perhaps the most worrying statistic, and one that I'm not going to go into but might be the focus of another talk, the number of people who believe that extraterrestrials have visited or are visiting appears to be higher than the number who believe in evolution. Okay, that might be a particular subset of the world's population, but still interesting in itself. Isn't it settled? This XKCD cartoon from a little while ago, a few years back, made the point that the fraction of people carrying cameras everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives, has followed this curve. And since the early 2000s, the number of cameras that are absolutely ubiquitous has been going up and is now approximately 100%. So is it not the case that we have now conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, whatever, simply because there are so many cameras around, it would obviously be clear if these things actually existed or not. But apparently, no, it's not settled. If you do a Google search on UFO, you find something of order 250 million web pages dedicated to reports of UFOs and images of UFOs. So despite what you might think about cameras being everywhere, no, it is definitely not settled. So I've classified UFO images into a number of different classifications here. Images that purport to be UFOs could be man-made objects. They could be natural objects mistaken for UFOs. They could be image artifacts and nothing to do with what's out there, but purely something in the camera. Or they could be deliberately faked. And of course, the elephant in the room is that there aren't just 4 categories, there should be 5 categories, and there is, of course, the possibility that UFO images are actually extraterrestrial spacecraft. So I'm going to look at UFO images that I think fall into those various categories. Let's just make sure we've got our definitions sorted out. I'll conform to the usual conventional usage of the word or the acronym UFO to mean an object observed in the sky that is not readily identifiable or readily identified. Regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And another useful tool, as we all know, for the rational scientist is Occam's razor, where you could say that if there are 2 explanations for an observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is usually the better. Or if you want to paraphrase that into something slightly more useful, simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex solutions for a given claim, for a given problem. So where do you find reliable information about UFOs? Well, finding information is easy. The tricky bit is the reliable. You can find information anywhere you decide to look. In the UK, perhaps rather less so than in the US, but still, you have the problem of how reliable is the information you're gleaning, whether it be reports or whether it be images. We would like to see images of extraterrestrial spacecraft that look like that, clear, detailed, in focus, no signs of the camera shaking whilst the image was being captured, well exposed if it was a daylight image. That's what we would really like to see if we want to prove the existence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. But that's not usually what we see when we go searching for UFO images. What we usually see is not so much that, something a little akin to that. It's usually blurred, out of focus. There's quite often evidence of camera movement. And if it's taken at night, it is almost universally overexposed. If we take an image like that and blow it up a little bit, what do we learn? Absolutely nothing. There is essentially nothing you can do with an image like that. And 90% or possibly 95%, some might argue 99% of images fall into the category that there's nothing there that we can grab a hold of. There's nothing to process, nothing to analyze that can tell us what the origin of that particular blurry blob happens to be. If the image is quite old, then we might be looking at a scan of a photocopy of a newspaper clip. And it's very rare that we actually find the original images to actually look at or analyze. If it's a more recent image, it's probably a digital image, and we have no way of telling directly whether or not that image has been manipulated or processed in some way before we get to see it, especially if it's been plastered on the internet. We have no real way of tracing it back to its origin. And that's part of the problem. So the images I'm going to show you today are not the blurry, can't make out what they are images. I'll be looking at a few different ones where we should be able to tell what they actually are. In terms of what do we think the earliest UFO was, I was quite intrigued to see this image of a hieroglyph where quite clearly we can see in the top left-hand corner an Apache helicopter, and in the top center we have what appears to be Luke Skywalker's speeder, and perhaps below that a Zeppelin. When I first saw this image, I thought, well, clearly it's just Photoshop and somebody has made something that looks like a hieroglyph. But only when I actually looked a little bit deeper did I realize that this is a genuine set of hieroglyphs. It is not fakery in the sense of image fakery via something like Photoshop. But then the explanation is for this particular weird set of glyphs that you can see here, the explanation is just as simple as saying somebody has faked it, because what we realize is going on is that there are actually 2 sets of hieroglyphs here. Two different pharaohs have both chiseled their hieroglyphs, and one pharaoh apparently has not eliminated the previous hieroglyphs before having a new set put on. I don't know quite why that should be, but if we look at the two sets of hieroglyphs highlighted in different colors, we can see that neither set of hieroglyphs shows us anything particularly interesting, and it's only the superposition of the two gives us these rather interesting shapes of the helicopter, the Zeppelin, the speeder, or whatever. So unfortunately, no evidence for UFOs if we go back to ancient history. So let's have a look at the first classification where we said that UFOs might be man-made objects. A number of man-made objects might be mistaken for UFOs. The United States Air Force has tried to make this very easy for us by giving us an identification chart to help us identify objects in the sky, especially if they're in daylight and we can see a silhouette outline. So some of these objects you might think might be, for instance, super secret spy planes or stealth aircraft. But no, the US Air Force have made this quite easy for us to identify what these are. The first one is a weather balloon. The second one is a weather balloon. The third one is a weather balloon. Fourth one is a weather balloon. Fifth one is a weather balloon. I'm not sure if you can tell what the next one is. That's right. Swamp gas. And then we've got a weather balloon, and then we have a weather balloon, a weather balloon. Despite what you may think, that's a weather balloon, and of course the last one is a weather balloon. So we can see that when we look at objects in the sky, we have to be very careful, and sometimes the appearance of an object belies its actual true nature. But if you've ever seen an object like this, I haven't personally, but if you ever saw something like that, who could not think UFO if you see a huge jellyfish in the sky like this? The launch, especially in the last couple of years or so, of Falcon rockets, which have been launched at the right time of day, at the right part of America, such that the trails left by the rockets catch the sun and then appear as bright against a dark evening background, you can get some spectacular rocket trails that look really weird and in some cases look nothing like what you would expect from the launch of a rocket. In some cases you get these glorious tails, and in other cases, if you're in the right place at the right time, looking in the right direction, the actual rocket trail can give some really weird and wonderful effects, as indicated here by the photograph taken in 2018. Rocket trails can produce rather odd effects. So, for instance, again, they are most beautiful when they're lit up by the sun, which is just below the horizon, so usually in the evening. And in this case, you can see these wonderful iridescent colors coming through as the sunlight hits the rocket trail. And the distortion of the rocket trail here is produced by winds at various altitudes, taking what would otherwise have been a relatively straight line rocket trail and distorting them into these weird and wonderful shapes, which I'm sure look really, really weird if seen from a distance. If we look at an astronomy picture of the day, or an APOD image, here taken from April 2019, we can see what appear to be some very odd objects floating in the sky. In the background, we have the very faint green of an aurora, and a little bit closer to us, but still, of course, more distant than the mountains or fields here, we see a number of cyan-coloured and blue-coloured objects, which must, again, look very odd if you happen to catch them when you weren't expecting them. These are effectively chemicals produced from sounding rockets that have been sent up into the upper atmosphere, releasing gases or chemicals which then fluoresce in the sunlight at those heights and produce these various colors. And this helps scientists judge what's going on at these elevated altitudes to get a better understanding of how the Earth's atmosphere interacts with what's going on just outside the Earth's atmosphere, space weather, if you like. And so these sounding rockets are sent up every once in a while, and if you're not expecting them, I'm sure they give rather an odd view to anybody that happens to see them. Other objects that will appear in our atmosphere, for instance, communications objects that are designed to either improve mobile phone reception. These could be floating around in our atmosphere, or of course we have things like the Starlink satellites, which could be orbiting the Earth and producing lots of dots in the sky, and depending on how those dots appear, whether they appear to be bundled together, whether they appear to be stretched out in a straight line, can give odd appearances for those that are not used to looking at satellites or objects floating in the Earth's atmosphere. If we have a look at this video, we can see what appears to be a collection of dots, but again, if you weren't expecting to see this, this could give you a very odd appearance, especially depending on how these objects have arranged themselves in the sky. Now, some of you might look at this and instantly recognize what it is that you're looking at, but the shape, the pattern that they make, can be very much dependent on the operator of, in this case, a whole large constellation of individual drones, probably mini drones. I'm not sure what the size is of these objects. Take a drone, put a light on it, and then you fly the drone in a way such that you can fly it in three-dimensional space in a way that's correlated with the other objects. Each of them has a light on board which you can switch on, switch off, or change color, and therefore you can effectively produce a billboard in the sky and produce all sorts of shapes. And I'm sure in the future, when these become even more common, I'm sure we're going to get lots of reports of UFOs when this sort of thing is seen, not necessarily from close up, but perhaps when it's seen from a distance, it could be confused with a UFO. Rather than being on the ground and looking up at the sky, sometimes it's the other way around. When the person is in the sky looking down at the ground, this has been reported as what are clearly a set of UFO landing pads down in the desert there, 3 objects on the ground. Now, it doesn't actually take too much to realize that if you're flying over this in a commercial aircraft, then lots of people would have seen these things. And if you simply make a note of when you took off, when you land, and when you saw this particular point, even if you haven't got GPS on the back of the seat in front of you, it doesn't take much to figure out where you were in the world when this particular site met you outside your window. And if you do that, you find that this particular collection of objects turns out to be a solar farm. Lots of reflecting mirrors here and a collection point in the middle. And depending on the angle of view that you make to all of these mirrors compared to where the sun is in the sky, you can get this rather odd effect that you don't get the same brightness on every mirror. And so you get the effect that we just saw as seen from a high-flying aircraft. Let's have another look at a classic video which is not as still and not as well defined as we would like. Here's an image taken, a video taken where somebody, I've taken the narration out because it's very irritating. Somebody is looking at an object on what appears to be the other side of a lake, claiming that they've seen this UFO hovering in the distance. This particular video has had, I don't know how many thousands, I'm not even sure if it's millions yet, thousands of hits from people who are convinced that, yes, this cigar-shaped object is indeed a UFO hovering over a town on the other side of the lake. Even when you get Goodyear Blimp saying, sorry guys, that's definitely us, even when it's been refuted, that doesn't stop lots of people going back to the video saying, wow, this is amazing, that is indeed proof of a visitation. So even when not simply skeptics, but even when the people responsible inadvertently for the UFO say, no, sorry, it's not a UFO, it's us, that doesn't stop people who believe in UFOs from saying, no, the evidence is still there, the evidence is still strong. When I started to trawl for images and videos to use in this sort of talk, I was especially delighted to realize when I did a Google search that somebody had produced some super clear footage of a UFO. And I thought, wonderful. And here's the video that was reported. This is the super clear footage of a UFO. And it's, as you would expect, jumping around all over the place. It might conceivably be in focus, but it was jumping around all over the place. If you wait for long enough, then the person who's getting quite excited at actually seeing something eventually settles down a little bit. And if we look at the end clip of this particular video, we see what's actually happening. We can see that now that we can home in on the object itself and it's not leaping around quite so much, we find that although it looks rather odd, it's fairly clear that it's simply a mylar balloon. It's a party balloon, one would guess. It seems to be in the shape of a letter J. So I would hazard a guess that somebody whose initial was J, Jonathan, was having a birthday party. This mylar balloon got loose and floated up into the atmosphere, caught the sun, and then some enthusiastic video photographer captured it and was posting it as super clear footage of a UFO. Again, it didn't take long before people said, well, I think that's just a mylar balloon. But even once it was identified, people still seemed to embellish the whole story behind the images and videos that are supposedly capturing these UFOs. So we've seen that UFOs in many cases can be simply man-made objects. But in a fair number of cases, UFOs actually could be natural objects. If we look, for instance, at clouds, that might seem a little bit mundane, but if we go to the Cloud Appreciation Society, yes, there is such a thing, who publish the Cloud of the Month. Yes, I kid you not, there is such a thing as the Cloud of the Month. They publish, you've seen these before, lenticular clouds that tend to hover around, especially over mountain tops. So those have often been confused with UFOs, depending on whether or not there's individual clouds or whole sets of them. This I thought was quite intriguing. The little dot at the top is just a bird that happens to be flying by, but you can see what appears to be an entire circle of little knots of cloud below the cloud base. It appears to be almost a perfect circle, and yet it sort of looks man-made, but is it natural? Is it man-made? Arguably, this is a combination of the two, because the explanation here is that an aircraft is circling, not visible because it's just inside the cloud itself, just above the bottom of the cloud base. But the changes of pressure produced by the aircraft circling is producing a change in the condensation of the cloud, and that produces this little effect, in effect, directly underneath where the aircraft is actually circling. So some aircraft has been put into a holding pattern and looks like it's making apparently a perfect circle and imprinting itself on the cloud base here. Other images of lenticular clouds, depending on the context, can look quite convincing in terms of flying saucers. One of my favorites is this one, which reminds me of one of the opening sequences from Independence Day, when a UFO, a large alien spaceship, comes out of what appears to be a cloud and then breaks free to hover over the city. This particular natural thunderhead cloud appears to be very much reminiscent of that. And there are structures called Fall Street clouds, which look for the world like this is a normal cloud bank, and then a large circular or perhaps oval-shaped UFO has come ploughing through the cloud and punched a hole in it, and that's what it appears to be. There's one in the distance there as well. But these so-called Fall Street clouds, again, are understood in terms of their formation once you understand the nature of condensation and its variation with temperature and pressure. A beautiful image of a lenticular cloud over Mount Fuji has been used many times. And this in itself is a beautiful image, but that doesn't stop people taking that image, throwing it into Photoshop, and then taking that lenticular cloud and exaggerating or going rather overboard and producing what appears to be a 5-layer pancake. I thought it was pretty spectacular in the first place before somebody got hold of it and showed what lenticular clouds effectively can't do, as far as I'm aware. But as well as having atmospheric phenomena that we could simply identify as clouds, there are various other atmospheric phenomena which can produce some very unusual effects, which again you might regard as being, in a sense, extraterrestrial until you understand the origin of the effect. So these light pillars, for instance, that are seen in northern latitudes, or rather extreme latitudes, north or south. Here we see what appear to be a lot of vertical searchlights coming out of the ground. Not surprisingly, the base of each of those light pillars is actually a light source, which we can't see behind the roofs. But then you can ask yourself, what is actually producing these things? Well, it's a whole load of ice crystals in the atmosphere. If the ice crystals tend to be quite flat, which happens at certain values of humidity and temperature, if the ice crystals are relatively flat, they can orient themselves so that they effectively produce lots of horizontal mirrors. And so you can imagine a whole set of mirrors in the atmosphere, and each of them is reflecting a light source that you can't see just over behind the roofs there. From a slightly larger distance, again, you can't see the lights themselves as they're just beyond the horizon, but the light pillars show themselves. In this case, most of the light pillars seem to go up to about the cloud base and then stop because there are no more ice crystals visible within the clouds themselves. The different coloured light pillars, the blues and the slightly yellower colours, are simply the result of the individual lights themselves. They're not a function of how the light is reflected from the ice. There are simply some blue lights and some orange lights in the distance, which we can't see, reflecting off those ice crystals. But in terms of mistaking those for a UFO, I think one of the most dramatic images, this one was taken from Astronomy Picture of the Day, as was the next one. And this, I think, is absolutely spectacular because the light pillars are elevated into the sky. They're not sitting down just above the horizon. In this case, we can see the very distant lights on the horizon themselves, some red lights, some blue lights, and the light pillars are telling us that there are ice crystals at very high altitudes here, perhaps above some of the lower clouds there. And so we're seeing the reflected lights almost like a mirage. But you can see the effect we're getting there. It's as if we've got a huge alien spacecraft hanging in the sky there, producing these wonderful coloured lights. Or perhaps you see that as an entire cityscape, a sort of ice mirage, if you like, hanging there in the sky. And I think that's a wonderful sight. I've never seen these for myself. But again, if you saw this in the sky and you didn't realize that you were simply looking at a reflection of more distant lights, that could be quite convincing as an unidentified flying object. Some of these light pillars, we have the ice crystals going up to a particular height, and then the orientation of the ice crystals starts to vary a little bit beyond a height of, what would that be, 20 or 30 or perhaps 40 meters. The ice crystals start to vary in their orientation, and so the very well-defined ice pillars going up for a few tens of meters start to fan out and give you this rather dramatic tree effect, where the light pillars are very well defined close to ground level, but then start to blur together as you go to higher altitudes. That, again, I think is a rather dramatic picture, perhaps not as rare as I first thought. This particular picture was taken from Wisconsin, for instance. It's hardly the Arctic Circle. Here we have a video looking up at a cloud, and the black on the either side is simply a couple of houses, and you see what appears to be fluctuating light in the middle of this cloud. The light seems quite bright and then seems to move and then accelerate very dramatically to the right and then jump back to the left. You see what appears to be something moving within the cloud, and it appears to be moving very dramatically with very high acceleration. It's not necessarily a very large field of view we're looking at, but when you realize that it's moved in only a fraction of a second, you have to think about things that are moving with a very high acceleration. Until you realize that nothing is actually moving. Again, this is a phenomena not totally dissimilar to the light pillars we saw before, because this is a result of ice crystals. That we're looking at the top of a thundercloud here, and the ice crystals will be reflecting sunlight, and the orientation of the ice crystals are not necessarily horizontal. They're being affected by the electric fields inside the top of this thundercloud. And the electric fields can jump around all over the place, especially when the bottom of the thundercloud is discharging through lightning, for instance. So there will be dramatic changes to the electric field in a cloud like that, and that can give rise to the ice crystals jumping around in terms of their orientation in a tiny fraction of a second. They're not physically moving through the cloud, they are just twisting and reorienting themselves under the influence of the electric field. And hence we can get light jumping around, apparently with very high acceleration. That's an illusion, because nothing is actually moving up there other than the reorientation of ice crystals. Another example of what we can see that's connected with thunderclouds is if we look above a thunderstorm. Here we see some sprites, some red sprites. I am sure that these look a lot brighter than, appear in this image a lot brighter than they actually appear by eye. I believe you can see them under favorable circumstances, but I think in this image has been enhanced to show the structure above the thunderstorm. It's sometimes described like high altitude lightning. Rather than lightning coming from the cloud down to the ground, these so-called high altitude lightning strikes appear to be above the cloud. But that's a little bit of a misnomer, because it's not really like lightning. It's more like fluorescence. And understanding the nature of sprites is something that's been researched in the last few years, the last few decades. And images like this, I don't think, are very common, because it's rather difficult to catch these sprites at their best. But another example that caught my attention in terms of a title was somebody who claimed to see an arc-shaped UFO over Ontario. And that caught my attention. I started reading what this person had imaged. And he or she says, nearing the end of the day, I sat down with my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. If there's any amateur astronomers amongst you, you probably have already got the gist of what it was this person was looking at. It was the end of the day. It was perhaps the early evening. They were looking west and they saw something brilliant white in the sky. What do you think that might have been? In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion is a UFO. UFO, for some people, seems to be the go-to explanation. If they don't have an immediate answer to what it is they're looking at, they don't go through a list of what else it might be. They jump number two. If I don't know what it is, number two option is it's a UFO. How big was this object that was seen in the sky? Well, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. Well, if it was something in the sky, can you really judge how big it is if you don't know how far away it is? This is one of the big problems when you ask somebody about a UFO report. What did you see? How big was it? How bright was it? Well, you can talk about how bright, but how big? How can you possibly work that out unless you can judge how far it is? My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. So what was this person looking at? In the evening, looking west, a large, brilliant white object. This person was looking at Venus. Venus is probably the #1 object that is confused with a UFO across the world. In this particular case, they took an image with a camera with an extreme zoom, and this has been zoomed in, and then this still frame has been taken from the video. Roughly speaking, that's what you might expect to see if you put a pair of binoculars on Venus when it's in its crescent phase. A pair of binoculars, like 10 by 50 binoculars, will show the crescent phase or the half phase of Venus quite nicely. And therefore, if anybody sees such an object in the sky, all you really need is a pair of binoculars, or if you wish, the zoom lens of a camera, and then you can definitely pick up this arc-shaped object. But given that we're talking about an evening object, which is brilliant white, it seems fairly obvious that this is Venus. It fits all the facts. So we've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects, but quite a lot of UFOs I've found when searching appear to be image artifacts. This is especially true for the large number of images in which somebody says, I took a photograph, I looked at the photograph, I seem to see something in there which is a UFO. I don't remember seeing it at the time, but here it is in the photograph. That's a classic example of, well, if you didn't see it at the time, but you've caught it in your camera, the chances are you've got an image artifact. This is not something that's recent. This goes back a long way. For instance, I found this picture from 1952 of a whole load of objects that seem to be buzzing behind this building there. They seem to be almost in formation as they're flying along. So what could these possibly be? Well, it doesn't take too much to look at that and then cast your eyes down, not at the fireflies at the top that appear to be behind the building. Look at the lights in the foreground, a whole load of lights that are shining into the camera. Take those lights, turn them upside down and put them at the top there. What do you find? Each of the fireflies that appears to be behind the building corresponds to one of these street lights at the front of the building. As soon as we do that, we actually notice that there are two objects which actually do indeed appear in front of the building, even though our tendency is to think of those objects as flying behind the building. So any time that you have bright lights shining into the camera, you are almost certainly going to get reflections. And in this case, I took the lights at the front of the building and turned them upside down, because virtually all the time you pick up a reflection, you'll get an inversion of some kind. And therefore, usually the reflection that you see is not as bright and usually upside down relative to the original light source. And that is indeed what we're looking at here. What about this particular example of what is clearly a UFO flying through the sky? The large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. Well, I'm not sure where the windows are here. I'll let you decide what you think is a window and whether or not that object towards the left-hand side of the image here is somebody looking out of one of these windows. This UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. This must be right. You can tell it must be right because aliens is in capital letters. So that tells you that this is really serious. But we shouldn't be looking at an object like this. We should be looking at the overall image. This is actually a very small, well, a relatively small crop of a bigger image. And when we realize that the original image had the camera pointing at what I suspect is probably the full moon, it's difficult to tell exactly what its phase is, but I would guess it's the full moon. The brightness of the full moon is coming right into the camera and producing a reflection. Now, in this particular case, I would hazard a guess that the lens might be a rather old one, and the lens flare here is rather dramatic. But even if you have a well-corrected lens, even if you have a modern lens in which all of the glass elements have been coated to reduce the amount of reflection, it is probable that if you shine a bright light into a lens, you will get a reflection of some kind. How prominent it is, how bright it is, will depend on the circumstances, the angle of the light source compared to where you're pointing, etc. And we can make that point by looking at a relatively recent image. Here, somebody has put this image on Twitter and said, "What is this in the sky?" Again, this is an example of, I don't remember seeing that at the time. This object in the sky appears to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? And this person posted this question on Twitter with hashtag UFO. And just to show that this person was absolutely serious about wanting to know an answer, this person put hashtag UFO, hashtag serious question. So in this particular case, they were asking about what is this object? I took this photograph of this lamp connected to a wall, and I didn't notice this UFO in the background. Let's blow that up so we can see it a little more clearly. What's going on here? Well, from what I told you in the previous slide, you can perhaps guess. We're shooting into the sun. The sun is just sneaking past that wall, so the sun is effectively a disk, most of which is showing behind that wall there, and is shining directly into the camera. And even if the camera lens is a high-quality lens, you're almost certainly going to get a reflection. So here we can see the sun peeping out behind the wall. So the sun would be a disk cut off on its right-hand side. What do we see in this reflection? We see a disk of the sun cut off on its left-hand side because it's effectively upside down. We also see a little bit of the filigree work that would be expected if the sun was shining through that lamp bracket that we can partly see in the main image itself. So all of that is entirely understandable in terms of simply a reflection of the sun upside down placed at a different position in the image. Another useful way of thinking about these reflections is it's not uncommon for the image to appear on the opposite side of the center of the image from the light source. So I don't know where the center of the image is because, of course, it might have been cropped from the original image, but it's not surprising to find the sun is in the bottom right quadrant of this image and the reflection is in the upper left quadrant of the image. There's plenty of instances where people post an image and then put a little description of what it is that they're actually showing. Here, there's an image of apparently a UFO, and here's the commentary that went with it. Note the power lines in the photo. I'm not sure I can see any, but there you go. As you can see, the wires show absolutely no distortion, which would indicate no camera jerk. Also, based on the wires in the photo, you can tell that we were shooting almost straight up when we took this picture of a UFO. I looked at this and thought, well, I'm not sure I can see anything that's described there, but it just didn't seem right to be talking about photographing a UFO, which they claim is overhead. So I took this image and played around with it, did some image processing, and eventually produced something that was a little bit clearer. And I think most people would now agree that what we're looking at is the wing mirror of some vehicle or another, and we're looking at the side of the road. So no, we're not looking at wires. No, we're not shooting straight up. If there are any lines in that image, it looks to me like they might be scratches on the film. They are certainly not wires that would indicate that there was no camera movement taken during the exposure. If anything, that looks like it was a relatively long exposure, and the camera has indeed moved during the exposure. But one of my favorites in terms of misinterpreting what you're looking was this huge slab in the sky. What appears to be a large, flat, rectangular aircraft with lights around its edges hovering in the air. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it is an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Giving it a name, giving it a label, adds a certain amount of credence to what it is they're talking about. But if you believe there's a large black slab in the sky with a sort of silver edge to it, you can either interpret it that way, or you can play with Occam's razor, and you can say, well, this appears to be taken through a car windscreen, because I can see raindrops at the bottom of the image, and it appears to be raining and it appears to be wet. So it looks like this is taken from the comfort of inside a car shooting through the windscreen. Is it not possible that this large rectangular aircraft in the sky is actually an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? And we're just looking at a reflection of the iPhone, as it were, superimposed on the sky. Well, again, Occam's razor, you choose which you think is the simplest answer to that. We've looked at man-made, we've looked at natural, we've looked at artifacts, and of course, unfortunately, some UFOs are simply faked. That was not exactly uncommonplace many decades ago, but these days it is getting more and more difficult to actually research genuine images, because so many of the images that you come across, if you do a simple search for them, so many of them are simply faked. Now, if you need to have a hand pointing at the object in your image, then I don't think anybody is taking that too seriously as a way of identifying that's the UFO I'm talking about, that disc there. That doesn't really help us. And some of them are just too good to be true. If there really was a spacecraft that size coming out of the clouds, again, a bit like Independence Day movie, then I'm sure we would have heard about it if there was indeed an object like that floating over the city somewhere. But if we look at a slightly more subtle approach to looking at UFOs, and as in UFO, as in fakery, here's an image of a couple of UFOs that were supposed to be buzzing Air Force One. This is clearly taken from some distance away, because none of the objects here are particularly clear, and Air Force One appears to be relatively low contrast, indicating there's a lot of atmosphere between the photographer and the aircraft, and that's what's reducing the contrast of this particular image. But if these two UFOs are supposed to be buzzing the aircraft and at approximately the same distance, then atmospheric distortion and reduction of contrast ought to be pretty much the same for them as it was for any other object. And if you look at the amount of blurring and the amount of contrast reduction in Air Force One, then you realize that what's going on with the UFOs looks a little bit suspicious. They appear to be too well defined and, generally speaking, a little bit too high contrast to be consistent with what we're looking at with Air Force One. So not definitive, but certainly very suspicious. If we have another look at a triangular UFO, in this case, one that's parked very conveniently on the deck of an aircraft carrier, well, there's a number of things that got me thinking about this. The first thing that caught my attention was the fact that the shadow of the triangular UFO at the top there doesn't look right. The shadow appears too sharp. The actual triangular shadow looks too sharp compared to the shape of the object itself. But I thought, is there any way of actually proving this? Given that part of what I do for research is image analysis, I wondered if we could take an image like that and prove conclusively that that particular triangular UFO does not belong in this particular image. So what I did was take a few pixels that are next to the F-18 jet that is sitting there on the deck. And what I've plotted on the vertical axis here is pixel intensity, and the horizontal axis is about, about 70 pixels taken along the line of the deck itself. And so what you see is variations in the actual intensity there. You can see it goes up and down, and that's exactly what you would expect for any natural object. You would expect to get a variation of pixel intensities that is not particularly reproducible. It looks noisy, it looks almost random. That's what you would expect. It's a combination of individual pixels having different intensities, and the fact that the image itself is probably a JPEG image, is probably a JPEG image. And that is perfectly natural that there will be some artifacts that produce a variation of pixel intensity, in this case along a line which is notionally the same value of grey. Most of these values are the same value of 66, 67, 68, 69. It doesn't matter what the units are, these are just relative intensities of the pixel values. So that's, if you like, a reference for what I regard as a perfectly reasonable part of the image. But if we look at pixel intensities close to the UFO, just to the left of the UFO there's a grey area, which is a similar grey to the area I've just picked out near the F-18 jet. But notice how the pixel intensities here appear to be varying and then dead flat. For, 20, 25 pixels, they have exactly the same intensity, and then they start to vary again. So this is definitely indicative of somebody having doctored the image. Now, perhaps they took a triangular UFO, whether it be a model or whether it be generated in CGI. This is then being pasted into the image of the deck of the aircraft carrier, and perhaps they needed to touch up the edge, and they've used perhaps a blurring tool to smooth out what would otherwise be signs of an edge or something like that. And as a result, they've left a telltale signature that something is wrong with that image. That is categorically a doctored image because of the nature of those pixel intensities. So regardless of the fact that you find it suspicious to see a triangular UFO there, regardless of the fact that the shadow doesn't look quite right, we can tell that that image has been doctored. And in a similar way, if we look at another, this was actually a still from a video, but it doesn't really matter. This was shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. Again, you can't see what's going on there, so I took the image and played around with the pixel intensities to make it easier to see what's there. And then we see the background modeling is entirely reasonable. That's what you would expect from, for instance, a JPEG image. If you haven't got much detail, then you will get this sort of mottling pattern in the background. But look at the UFO itself. The triangular outline of that UFO is extremely precise compared to the background mottling, the background noise, if you will, that would be in the rest of the image. So again, that is obvious fakery. I quite like this one. This was a picture taken out of an aircraft window, a commercial airliner. And again, it's one still out of a much longer video. And as well as seeing the wing of the aircraft and the clouds in the distance, you can see what appears to be a UFO, perhaps flying in the opposite direction as it goes past the aircraft. This might be convincing if it wasn't for the fact that when you look in detail at that UFO, you find it bears a striking resemblance to the CGI aircraft that are rendered in a certain video game that I can't mention for legal reasons. And you realize that somebody has taken this particular CGI rendering of a craft, and by making it smaller and perhaps blurring it slightly, they've tried to convince you that this is actually in the image. But again, no, it is just fakery. So we've looked at the four standard ways of identifying UFOs: man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, or fakery. But we have to return to the elephant in the room and say, okay, UFOs might be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now, some people have spent their life cataloguing these, and here's a classification of a number of different UFOs. This is based on, it says at the bottom if you can't read it, based on actual sightings. So I'm very impressed that by taking reports of actual sightings, you can then classify all of these objects seen by lots of people over the years and classify them into 80 distinct types of UFO. Well, I say 80, but if you look at the title, UFO Sightings Set 1, so presumably there's more than 80 of them, and this is just the first 80 that have been catalogued by a certain individual. I find that surprising, to say the least. What I find particularly irritating is not necessarily what I find in terms of images and videos, either by Google searches or on YouTube or in other places. Other sites are available. But for instance, what is considered evidence when you look at some of these TV programs which report, for instance, here's an image taken in Rendlesham Forest, and what you can quite clearly see here is evidence for a UFO landing. And if you're struggling to see the evidence for a UFO landing, what they're claiming is that quite clearly there are 3 landing feet disruptions in the soil here. So clearly 3 pads of a triangular UFO landed in this forest, and you can see those landing feet there. Now, this definition of evidence is pushing evidence to the absolute extreme, as I'm sure many skeptics would agree. But this is the sort of thing that I find particularly annoying. This argument that, as you can clearly see here, we have evidence for a triangular UFO landing in the forest. But regardless of the lack of evidence, it does lead to a question. If there's no evidence for UFOs being extraterrestrial in origin, then you can start to ask the question, well, if the number of stars in the Milky Way is about 300 billion or so, and we now know that most of them have planetary systems, that wasn't known a few decades ago, but now we've got a pretty good idea that 50% of stars in the Milky Way seem to have a planetary system of some kind or another. That means 150 billion. And again, we didn't know this until relatively recently, but Earth-like planets are much more common than we first thought. It was thought perhaps Earth-like planets are extremely rare, but now it's thought that Earth-like planets could be as more than 10% of the total number of planets in the Milky Way. The big problem is we have no good way of identifying or quantifying the likelihood of life originating. Some people say it's 100% and life will always find a way. Others say, no, life is not that likely. So just for the sake of argument, let me put some numbers in here. Let's assume that 99% of the time an Earth-like planet doesn't develop life. So we have to divide by 100. That gives us 500 million. And again, what is the likelihood that life originates but doesn't develop any further into, for instance, complex multicelled life? Again, let me play devil's advocate and say 99% of the time it gets no further. So we divide by 100 again. And then the last step, of course, is what's the likelihood that complex life develops into intelligent life? And again, I have no reason to think otherwise. I'm simply going to pull a number out of thin air and assume that 99% of the time, complex life does not develop into intelligent life. And so we divide by 100 again. So even if intelligent life is only 1 in a million, that still means 50,000 civilizations. And you can ask the question, where are they? The familiar Fermi paradox. Yes, I know I'm ignoring the fact that a civilization may come into existence and then may destroy itself within 100 years or 1,000 years. It won't necessarily last for many thousands or millions of years. So we have to take that into account when asking the question, where are the extraterrestrials? Perhaps you're familiar with this picture, taken by Voyager 1, looking back at the Earth. There's the Earth. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The famous pale blue dot of Carl Sagan, 1994. The pale blue dot reminds us that the only life that we actually know is terrestrial life. And the appearance of UFOs in our skies is not proof of visitation by extraterrestrials. But what I personally find more unsettling is the thought that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was absolutely brilliant. For those of you who are interested, Steve has a number of other talks planned for this year, and a list of them is all available on his website, which I'm sure one of our friendly mods will happily post into the chat for you. We're going to take a 15-minute break now, so we'll be back about 10 past. So go get a drink, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We're going to go straight into the Q&A now with Dr. Steve Barrett. So I'm going to just go straight into the questions that you guys have asked and voted for on Slido. So we will start with a question from Cleo. If you get the opportunity to give the photographers direct feedback about what their images actually are, do they believe you?
I very rarely get the opportunity to do that, but I think there's a fundamental difference between people who present UFO images and, for instance, picking at random, people who believe that the moon landings were hoaxed. There are certain conspiracy theorists who will not budge. I think with UFOs, it's different. If somebody has an image and you're prepared to explain that image to them, most people would say, oh, right, I didn't realize that. That's a much better explanation than an extraterrestrial spacecraft. And I think that's completely different from moon hoax, where if you give somebody an explanation, they will outright not believe you, is my experience of how they approach that. So most people who produce UFO images would be quite happy to have them explained.
I think a lot of them, based on your talk, especially the ones towards the end, they didn't take them intending them to be UFO. They took a picture and then went, oh, what's that?
Yes, quite a lot of Twitter and Facebook is full of precisely that. I wonder what that is. Is it a UFO? And if they did get an answer, they'd be happy, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The second question comes from a fantastic person called Dave J. Were you ever a believer?
Believe in what? Believe in extraterrestrials or believe in unidentified flying objects being extraterrestrial spacecraft?
Go for both.
Okay. Belief that UFOs are spacecraft? No, I was never a believer. In a sense, I've always believed in extraterrestrial life. That's always appeared logical to me. But these particular lights in the sky? No, I don't think so.
Simon asks, what is it about the American belief system that makes them the main believers in UFOs, if that's even the case?
That appears to be the case. Part of the problem is all the statistics are skewed. For instance, I could only find the survey from the Chapman University. I can't find a survey of the equivalent number of Europeans to actually check where the numbers stand. The numbers almost don't seem believable. I find it very difficult to believe that 40% or 35% of Americans actually believe that aliens are walking amongst us. Maybe some of you are quite happy with that idea, but I don't know where these people get their numbers from. I have no particular gripe with Chapman University, but who do they ask? Who is it that they're actually interrogating when they get these numbers? So being higher than evolution, I can almost believe, but I would have thought all the numbers would be lower.
Probably psychology students. That's where they seem to test most people, because they're easily found and they're quite happy to contribute. Well,
okay. Don't psychology students know better? I don't know.
Rob H asks, what do you make of the US DoD releasing classified videos of unexplained aerial phenomena around April 2009?
I think a lot of UFOs, if you go back through, not conspiracy, well, yes, it is conspiracy theory in the sense that the government clearly didn't want people to actually start reporting about their spy planes and their other secret programs. And the idea of, well, if we encourage the idea that these are actually UFOs, it'll take the heat off us explaining that we've just been testing our latest stealth aircraft. So it is undeniable that some things that were reported as UFOs were indeed special projects, whatever you call them, special ops. And therefore, it is no surprise that some of this was then released. And lo and behold, what was reported in the 50s and 60s were indeed the test runs of stealth aircraft. So that's no surprise.
But it just leads to more conspiracies. Oh, yeah, they were hiding it.
And in fact, it's true, because it was a conspiracy amongst the Department of Defense or the American government, because they saw that as a convenient way of just not lying, but simply taking the heat off, explaining their stealth aircraft or whatever it was.
Can't discuss it as classified.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant. That's really going to help with the conspiracy theorists. Yep. Skeptical Gumby from Oxford asks, if you saw a genuine unexplained craft, would you be happy or sad?
Craft meaning actually a UFO sitting in my garden?
Yeah, let's go with that.
As opposed to just seeing a light in the sky. Would I be happy or sad? I'd be happy in the sense that I don't like the idea of being alone in the galaxy. And if there was some proof of extraterrestrial life, if it happened to visit me rather than somebody else, well, that's a bit odd, but if there was proof that extraterrestrials do exist, in a sense, I would be happy. I'd be wary, but I'd be happy.
Andrew asks, who funds your research? Go on, be honest. Are you one of them?
Do you mean the research that I do to give a talk like this, or do you mean my university research? This is nothing to do with, okay, it's images, but my work at the university is funded by Cancer Research UK because I'm doing medical imaging. This stuff that I do on moon hoax or UFOs or anything to do with outreach of astronomy or space flight, this is just what I do in my spare time, of which I have more than I would like in these days.
Yeah, you're using your own special skills that you've developed through the medical research to be able to analyze things that people with less experience would not be able. I mean, I looked at a lot of those pictures. I was looking at the chat and people were going, oh, this is clearly this. And they were seeing the same thing as you. And then there are other ones where it's just like, what? What's that?
Yeah, I think there's a question about that a little later. Yeah.
Oh, is there? Anonymous asks, what do you think about witnesses who are supposed to be specially gifted or trained at identifying stuff like pilots or police people?
Yes, some people have more training than others, but that doesn't mean that what they say is absolute 100% gospel truth. They can still be misled and they can still be slightly economical with the truth. I've seen videos of footage taken from an aircraft in which the pilot is saying, wow, look at that UFO go. It's zooming off at a hell of a rate. But if you analyze the video, what's actually happening is the aircraft is traveling so fast, you're looking at the object against a cloud background and you're simply mistaking your very high speed with the object's very high speed. And even trained pilots, I'm sure, can occasionally just be slightly disoriented, and when they're looking at these things, they just get it wrong. And they might say that thing appears to be moving really fast, but they cannot measure the velocity of that object. It's just their personal opinion of what it looks like at the time. So no disrespect to any pilots, whether they be military or commercial, but they don't necessarily produce proof that trumps anybody else's observations.
But it's also true that memory is very fickle. You know, what you think you remembered is not necessarily what you actually remember. You saw a blob, which all of a sudden becomes more and becomes more until eventually, no, I saw a full-blown UFO and the aliens were waving from the window.
Yep, indeed.
Staphylococcus asks, are there any UFOs that did turn out to have any kind of secretive or conspiratorial explanation that emerged much later?
Well, that comes back to what we said about the stealth program. Stealth aircraft are a classic example of that.
Anonymous asks, the Earth's orbit is littered with satellites and garbage. Anything ET would be detected. Why do still these blurry images get traction in the collective psyche?
Because conspiracy theories are always popular, and we can argue till the cows come home as to why people like the idea of a moon hoax conspiracy, or the government being against us, or JFK's assassination, or Princess Di, and there's no lack of things you can go for. Some people just like controversy and like talking about stuff, regardless of whether the evidence... I'm a scientist, so everything I do is evidence-driven, regardless of my gut feeling. Some people just don't see the world that way.
Skeptical Gumby again from Oxford asks, if a UFO was an alien craft, then surely it wouldn't be unidentified and therefore not a UFO. What would be a more accurate term? And I know we talked in the break about one of the ones suggested in the chat, which was unidentified sky thingy.
Perfectly good.
Any other better suggestions?
Not really, no. I mean, UFO doesn't mean unidentified. It means not readily identified. You could argue that, oh, there's a bird. I don't know what type of bird it is. Is that an unidentified flying object? Because I don't know the species. At what point do you draw the line? It's really just semantics. So UFO has been with us for so long, it's good enough.
Your bird analogy was actually brought up in the chat. Earlier on, somebody mentioned that I don't recognise any birds, therefore are they all unidentified flying objects?
I was actually thinking of putting that in as a slide, a picture of a bird I took and saying, can you identify it? And if the answer is no, then there we go. It's a UFO.
Unidentified.
But that's why I started with, I'll take the convention that UFO is an object that is not readily identifiable.
Garnet asks, do you know what sort of tools are used to produce the fake images? Simple or professional tools?
They can be simple. I would argue that as long as you know what you're doing, you can use a simple graphics package and produce images which are very difficult to tell from genuine. Obviously, the professionals can do a far better job, but I believe in 5 minutes, you can take a standard graphics package and manipulate a moon image or a UFO image and produce something which would take extreme scrutiny to actually work out was fake.
I think it also depends who's looking at that image as well.
Yes.
If you're looking at it with your own trained eye, using zooming in and all the software, I imagine you've got software available to you then to analyze it.
Yes.
It's very different for you to even a skeptic who, looks for the truth, but doesn't necessarily have the tools or the training to be able to do that analysis.
And how many people go and watch a movie and say, well, that CGI is superb, but I can tell that alien isn't real?
I bet you could. If you looked at it with your software.
I think the professionals are so good. I think if they produced a still image and I sat down with it, I probably could not tell if it had been generated by computer or had genuinely been taken. I couldn't work it out from artifacts in the image. I think it's that good these days.
Which I know,
which again is one of these questions, I think.
I know, having listened to your moon landing talk that you did for us for Coventry, you had some images that you went, look, this is impossible to do with what was available in the 60s.
Yeah.
But you then, your very last slide that you showed us was one that you faked, just to show, actually, no, I can do this these days because these days it's available.
Yep, and it took me 5 minutes.
And yeah, it's a very different situation now to what it was in the 60s. And you said in that talk, you know, there are things they did that there's no way they could have done it back then.
Yes. 50 years is a long time.
Exactly. And especially with the advance of computers and technology.
Oh, yeah, this is the question, actually, yeah.
Oh, yes. Anonymous asked, do you think the technology of fakery will soon develop to the point that it will be impossible to prove or disprove the authenticity of an image?
Yep, I think we're there. If a professional wanted to do this, they could produce images that virtually no amount of inspection could prove were not real. I think we've got to that point in the last few years that as long as you put the time and effort in, and it would need an experienced individual with very complex software and a lot of servers at their disposal. But yes, it can be done to the point where no one else could unpick that image and prove it's fake.
Have you done any work yourself with the deep fakes type thing? Obviously, slightly different part of image.
No.
I just wondered if it was anything you'd even looked at all. No. Okay. Angel Swine asks, what implications do these conspiracies carry to wider society? Or is this a generally benign area of belief that can be stepping stones to more radicalization?
UFOs I don't see as a problem or radicalization. I think UFOs, as you sort of hinted at earlier, most of the time they are innocent misidentifications of what's actually there. And UFO is simply a knee-jerk reflex. I don't know what it is I've photographed. Let's call it a UFO. If somebody proves otherwise, then fine. But most people are not out to get you. They are genuinely misled by what they're looking at or what they've photographed. I don't put this into the same category as the people who fervently believe that the government has fooled all of us and that coronavirus is produced by 5G and the moon landings never took place, and all of these other ones, which are more sinister, if you like. UFOs I regard as being a rather innocent conspiracy theory on the whole.
But you've probably got a lot of people out there who do believe that 5G caused coronavirus and have then tagged that onto, oh, well, it was probably done by aliens, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Who else is going to use 5G? Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Paul, aka Picticule, asks, are you aware of a correlation between the belief that UFOs are aliens and fundamentalist religious belief? If so, why might that be?
No, I'm not aware of that connection. And I can't say that I know anybody who is a fervent believer in UFOs, regardless of any evidence that's presented to them. So again, this is in a different camp from moon hoax believers, where I've talked to them and you can't convince them. I have not talked to that many people who've seen UFOs, but on the whole, if we've chatted about it and I've come up with something which is plausible, they're usually happy with that. I haven't come up with anybody that's absolutely entrenched in their ideas and in any way links it to anything else.
Okay. Anonymous asks, which alien race is the most aggressive?
We are.
We are. Good answer. Anonymous asks, have you looked into or have any thoughts on reports by pilots, for example, by USA Navy pilot David Fravor?
I don't know that name offhand. I have seen things that have been reported as being associated with reports from pilots, whether they be Navy pilots or others. And some of them I do not believe hold any more or less credence than any other report of UFOs. So although you could argue that pilots have had more training and should be less susceptible to hyperbole or anything else, the ones I have seen are not any more convincing if they've come from a pilot than if they've come from Joe Public.
Especially when it's like sort of light-based, you know. Tricks of light happen no matter how well trained you are.
Yeah.
We've all seen optical illusions and things, and they trick you.
Perception is another thing that I'm quite interested in, is perception, and how perception is so easily fooled, whether it be an optical illusion or anything else. You believe your senses, but when it's pointed out that you cannot believe your senses under 99% of situations, it's a little bit disconcerting, but it's a reminder of just how we perceive the world and how we make sense of everything that's coming in from our five senses. But that arguably is a slightly different area. Yeah. But I think
there's also an interesting part about mindset here, about when you look at one of those pictures of alien spacecraft. I looked at some of those pictures, especially the cropped ones, and thought, oh, that's really interesting. What is that? And my mindset was, what is that? What, can somebody please give me an explanation?
Yeah.
I would imagine the UFO conspiracy theorists are there going, I know exactly what that is. I don't need anybody to confirm this.
Yeah. I can classify it. It's UFO type 3B. Yes. Yeah.
Whereas we would look at it and go, right, I want to know what that is. Please, somebody out there. And even the people who are posting the pictures, you were saying a lot of them are posting them going, what is this? Please tell me what this is.
That's fine. Yeah. But, you know, scientists would hopefully apply Occam's razor and say there might be a number of explanations for what we're looking at. Which do we think is the simplest one that explains the facts?
Another question from Grey the Earthling. And that is his name in the Twitch chat and always has been. So he's not changed it for this specific talk. But Grey the Earthling asks, are there any correlations between reports of UFOs and reports of alien abductions?
I have not researched this. I would believe so, but I deliberately veered away from looking at reports of UFO sightings because I wanted this particular talk to be focused on images, because that's where I feel that I can make some sort of comment. And what I didn't want to do, partly because when you look at UFOs, the number of comments and reports of sightings and abductions is 10 or 20 times bigger than the number of images. It's a whole different ballgame if you want to go down the line of reading people's reports and trying to make sense of them. So I am not aware of any correlation because I have not really dug into that area.
Grey the Earthing again asks, if aliens are competent enough to make interstellar spacecraft, why aren't they competent enough to either hide properly or introduce themselves?
Well, maybe they have hid properly. Maybe all of the things I've shown by Occam's razor have got a simple explanation. And maybe we have been visited by extraterrestrial intelligence and they've made such a good job of it, we don't actually know that.
Yeah. Possible.
Yeah.
Lizzo asks, in the course of your work, have you analysed and debunked photographs of unexplained phenomena other than UFOs? And if so, which were the most interesting?
I guess the other work that I've done is looking at images from the moon hoax conspiracy genre, as it were. And that's what originally got me interested. I'd spent many years doing image analysis as part of my research. And at some point, it sort of came to my attention that some people claimed that if you look at these images that supposedly were taken on the surface of the moon, you can tell they're fake because of A, B, C, D, E, and then there's a list of 100 different reasons why these images are fake. And I was interested in that along the lines of, well, regardless of what they say, can I take those images and probably not prove them to be real, but at least show that the comments that are made as to why they're fake are actually incorrect. And so I've done a fair bit of work looking at images, trying to understand the origin, not always unpicking the images, sometimes simply asking the question, what is the simplest explanation for this image? It's claimed it's fake because the shadows are wrong or this is wrong. Can we actually look at that image and convince ourselves, no, that's not a good reason for calling this image fake? So I didn't tend to unpick the images, but I looked at the science behind, can you show that these images are fake or not?
And for those of you who haven't seen Steve's talks on the moon hoax, hopefully he'll be giving it somewhere and you'll be able to see it somewhere because it is a fantastic talk. Igor asks, what's your favourite previously unexplained natural phenomenon?
I think sprites are something that because they weren't known about a long time ago. When they were first discovered, I thought that was very curious. The idea of lightning coming up out of clouds and going out into space seemed so bizarre when it was first discovered. I thought that was very interesting, and I figured that, okay, this is probably not extraterrestrial, but still, it's a phenomena that occurs on planet Earth that we weren't aware of until people took the right images at the right time and showed that sprites exist above thunderclouds. And I thought that was an interesting development of understanding what's going on and helping us understand how weather works based on what's going on in terms of electrical phenomena above clouds. So that was one I found quite interesting.
Turns out weather has a lot to do with this. It's weather balloons or it's weather. They seem to be pretty much most of them. Andrew H. asks, what are the chances that in his last act in the White House, Trump gives us the real Roswell and Area 51 story? Come on, Donald.
Yeah, well, that would be nice, but I don't think he's ever going to leave the White House, so I don't think that applies.
Anonymous asks, surely the speed limit of C and the time span of a life-supporting universe reduces any Drake equations result to effectively zero?
No, the speed of light doesn't matter. If you think the Drake equation is telling you you've got a certain number of civilizations, if you assume the civilization lasts for, I'm not sure how many thousands of years you would need, but if it's a reasonable length of time, then it is possible to colonize the entire galaxy in only about 1 million years. And this is staying within the speed of light limit. So I'm not talking necessarily about a race of beings necessarily exploring the entire galaxy within one generation, but if they go to the next star system and then the next star system and then the next star system, it might be thousands of years between each step, but after 1 million years you will have covered the entire galaxy. So the question is, if a race existed 10 million years ago, why is there no evidence somewhere out there in our neighborhood that they've been around?
I think the argument against the Drake equation is the unknowns, because there are so many where you went, I'm going to pull a number out of my hat.
Yep.
And that number could be anything. The
Drake equation is not supposed to give you the answer. The Drake equation is supposed to stimulate discussion on the subject.
Absolutely. Anonymous asks, what do you make of the Black Knight satellite conspiracy?
I'm not sure I know this one.
Nor do I.
Oh.
So it was just something that somebody's asked. If you don't know, we'll move on.
I think Black Knight, I'm thinking of Black Knight being something else rather than the Black Knight satellite. So I'm thinking of the Black Knight missile, but okay.
Okay, we'll move on. Anonymous asks, besides how unlucky intelligent life may be, what of the unlikeliness that of light speed travel that would need, we've kind of discovered that.
That's sort of there.
That's sort of the same question we've just had.
Over long enough time periods, light speed is not a problem.
Yeah. Brian_B asks, people don't want to refute their own UFO videos as they would not get the YouTube hits and revenue, even if they do know what it is. So this is very much around people make a lot of money off some of these videos, don't they?
That's probably why, even when they're refuted, enough people will watch them and they will stay on YouTube, and the person who posted them won't take them down if they're getting the hits, and especially if they're getting the revenue. Absolutely.
And also it's one of these rabbit holes where you watch one and its suggested next video will be another UFO video and another UFO video, and it takes you down this rabbit hole. It's like some of the other things we've seen. The Flat Earth is another one I know. You watch one Flat Earth video, your next suggested video will be another Flat Earth video, and so on, until you're so far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think the same is true of moon hoax. Plenty of things that I cover in my moon hoax are the really simple ones that have been refuted years and years and years ago. But that doesn't stop people regurgitating the same old arguments, because ultimately they presumably get enough hits to justify it.
Okay, somebody's just sent me what the Black Knight satellite conspiracy is. So I'm going to read it out to you, and we'll get your on-the-fly interpretation of it. So the Black Knight satellite conspiracy theory claims that a spacecraft is in near polar orbit of the Earth, which is of extraterrestrial origin, and that NASA is covering up its existence and origin. There's a bit more, but go on. What are your thoughts on that?
Why are they doing that? Do we have any reason behind this?
You're expecting me to hang on. I'll carry on a little bit. So this conspiracy theory combines several unrelated stories into one narrative. A photo taken during the STS-88 mission, claimed by some to show the Black Knight stellar satellite, is catalogued by NASA as a photo of space debris, and space journalist James Oberg considered it as a probable debris of a thermal blanket. Confirmed as
there is so much debris up there that I would argue that any image of anything that's seen is 99.99% more likely to be debris than it is anything else. So unless there's very compelling evidence, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl Sagan again.
Yeah.
We're going to do a couple more questions. So Anonymous asks, I've heard that videos of UFOs taken by military aircraft witnessed by different military personnel are the only ones worth investigating. Comments, examples?
Again, I wouldn't put military observations over and above everything else. Yes, they ought to be trained better and they ought to be less speculative, but they're still human.
But also a lot of American aviators are actually very young. Then, so they don't have necessarily the experience to be able to interpret what some of the older aviators will have seen and gone, well, I've seen that 5 times before.
Yeah.
I know that's a weather balloon.
Yes, I mean, you could argue that you should take more notice of not elderly, but more experienced commercial pilots who might have the sort of necessary experience to judge, well, I've never seen one of those before. That was totally out of left field. Rather than a younger military pilot, perhaps.
And also with commercial pilots, they're moving at a steady speed all the time. So they're not fluctuating, into these hard turns and that kind of thing, which are likely to blur things more for them.
Yep.
Our last question comes from Nadia. What about crop circles? Is it true they are formed by hedgehogs dancing during the full moon?
No, it's a new moon, not a full moon. Got that completely wrong.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Steve. At least you've cleared that one up for us. So thank you very much to Dr. Steve Barrett. Absolutely fantastic talk. Brilliant Q&A. We are obviously back here again next week where we have Pixie Turner. If you're also interested in seeing Pixie Turner, she is also talking at QED 2018 again, which will be this weekend. If you want more information, go to qedcon.org, and there is a list of what's going on over the whole 2 days, including a live recording of Incredulous. Again, believe it or not, we're getting another one. I know they don't happen very often, but we've got another one. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us next week for Pixies Talk. And next week as well with Pixies Talk, we have the Occam Awards. So the Skeptical Activist of the Year and the Rusty Razor. So thank you very much. See you all again soon and good night.